Her name appears only once, written in faded ink across a brittle prison record from 1881. Margaret Poole, age 18. Factory hand? Crime, theft of address. It's a small entry, almost forgettable. Just another name among thousands of others who passed through the Victorian prison system. But that one line stopped us cold. Who was she? What could have driven a girl, barely out of childhood, to steal a dress and lose her freedom for it? The record gave us nothing more. No story, no reason. Just a name, a number, and a punishment. But sometimes that's all it takes to open a door to the past. So we began to search. Through censuses written in careful script. Through newspapers that smelled faintly of dust and age. Through family trees built by strangers who may never know what they've uncovered. Piece by piece, her life began to form, a shadow taking shape. What we found wasn't the story of a criminal. It was the story of a child born into struggle, a woman crushed by a system that offered no mercy, and a mother forced to hide her own child to protect her name. Margaret's life had been buried for more than a century. Now, at last, we're bringing her back into the light. And to understand Margaret's fall, we have to return to where it all began, the streets of Salford in the 1860s. A world of blackened brick and endless smoke, where the air itself seemed tired. Here families lived shoulder to shoulder in narrow terraces, their windows filmed with soot, their rooms filled with the smell of damp and coal. This was where Margaret was born, a child of the industrial age, the daughter of Richard and Ellen Poole. Her father worked as an outdoor laborer, taking whatever work the day offered. Her mother scrubbed clothes for pennies, her hands red and cracked from lye and cold water. There was no luxury, no safety net, just survival. The 1871 census gives us a quiet moment of their life. Margaret was 6 years old then, living with her parents and two younger brothers. A small family caught in the grinding rhythm of Victorian poverty. The days were long, the nights cold. Childhood was brief. For working-class families, every day balanced on the edge of disaster. An injury, an illness, a lost job could send them spiraling. And for girls like Margaret, the path ahead was already written. Factory floors, endless hours, and wages too small to dream on. But even among those gray streets, there must have been small flashes of light, laughter, music from a nearby pub, the warmth of family in a single candlelit room. It's easy to forget that every story of hardship begins with a life that once held hope. Margaret's story was no different. She began as a child like any other, innocent, curious, unaware that the world she'd been born into would one day brand her a criminal. In the narrow streets of Salford, childhood was short. The air was thick with coal smoke, the sounds of clanging metal and shouting men filling every day. For girls like Margaret, play quickly gave way to work, scrubbing, stitching, serving. By the time most children learned to read, she had already learned the rhythm of survival. Each morning she walked past the factory gates, watching lines of weary women vanish into the noise and steam. It was a glimpse of her own future, one she could neither escape nor control. The city didn't wait for dreams. It swallowed them whole. And so, bit by bit, innocence faded. The laughter of childhood dulled into the exhaustion of endless labor. Poverty pressed closer, choices narrowed, and one small misstep, just one, could send a life spiraling. By the time Margaret reached 18, childhood was long behind her. The mills of Salford had taken it, one exhausting day at a time. She was now a factory hand, working 12-hour shifts in rooms thick with lint and the ceaseless hum of machinery. The air burned the lungs and accidents were common, but leaving wasn't an option. For most young women, the factory was the only place that would take them. The world of the 1880s offered little mercy. Wages barely covered rent, and food prices climbed higher each winter. Respectability was expected, but survival often demanded small acts of defiance. And that's where Margaret's name appears again, this time in the records of a Manchester court. The charge was simple: theft of a dress. To the magistrate, it was just another case. To Margaret, it may have been the difference between dignity and shame. A stolen garment in a world that judged women by appearance alone. Her sentence was 1 year in prison, harsh, even by Victorian standards. But the system wasn't built for understanding. It was built for punishment. When the next census arrived in 1881, Margaret wasn't listed at home with her family. Instead, her name appeared on the rolls of Bellevue Jail in Manchester, a place meant for petty offenders, where lives were measured in silence and shame. Behind those walls, Margaret's story changed forever. The girl from Salford, born into struggle, was now part of the machinery of punishment, another young woman swallowed by the system that claimed to protect society. But before those cell doors closed behind her, the world outside had already turned its back. The courts didn't see a frightened young woman caught in the trap of poverty. They saw a repeat offender, a name already stained by shame. The newspapers printed her story beneath bold headlines and judgmental tones, reducing her to a cautionary tale. In the eyes of Victorian England, women like Margaret weren't victims, they were examples. Proof that poverty could corrupt, that morality needed policing. What they didn't see was how society itself had left her with nowhere else to go. So when the verdict was read, 7 years imprisonment, it wasn't just a sentence. It was the end of the small, flickering hope she had left. The cold walls of Bellevue Jail waited, ready to erase whatever humanity still clung to her name. Bellevue Jail was not a place for redemption. It was a warehouse for the forgotten, rows of narrow cells, stone walls dripping with damp, and a silence broken only by the echo of boots on the floor. For young women like Margaret, it was a world stripped of warmth, of color, of hope. The prison was built to reform, but in truth, it existed to break. Days began before dawn. Prisoners scrubbed floors, picked oakum, or sat in silence sewing coarse fabric for hours on end. They were forbidden to speak. Even a whispered word could mean punishment, bread and water, isolation, or the lash. In the conduct books, Margaret's name appears again, but this time not beside a crime, beside her suffering. The entries are short, almost careless. September 1883, attempted to strangle herself with cotton. A few months later, singing loudly in cell. Then, broke glass in cell door, damaged table. To the wardens, these were marks of disobedience. To us, they are signs of a young woman unraveling. Imagine her, shut away, barely 20, her hands raw from work, her mind fraying in the silence. The song she sang might have been the only sound she could still control, a final act of defiance in a place that had taken everything else. Margaret's world had narrowed to a few square feet, her days blending into one another. And yet she endured. The records show she was eventually described as well-behaved, a note that feels more tragic than comforting, as if resignation were the only escape left to her. But even broken spirits find ways to survive. When Margaret left Bellevue Jail, she was no longer the same girl who had entered. Her sentence had ended, but freedom didn't mean forgiveness. Society had long memories, and little mercy for women marked by scandal. Jobs were hard to find. Landlords turned away fallen women, and neighbors whispered behind closed doors. But Margaret had one reason to keep moving forward. She was a mother. Somewhere in those lost years, perhaps before prison, perhaps soon after, she had given birth to a child. The records don't say who the father was. No marriage certificate, no husband's name. Just another silence in a life full of them. What the documents do reveal is startling. In the 1891 census, a little girl appears, listed not under Margaret's name, but under that of Margaret's own parents. The child was raised as their daughter, not their granddaughter. Hidden in plain sight. For a Victorian woman, this was both a scandal and a survival strategy. An unmarried mother faced ruin, no work, no respect, no future. By giving her child to her parents, Margaret had protected her baby from the shame that would have destroyed them both. It was an act of sacrifice disguised as secrecy. Years passed, and Margaret's own name slowly faded from the records. She lived quietly in Salford, later appearing alongside a man named Samuel Truman, perhaps a final chance at stability, perhaps love. But she never reclaimed her child under her own name. To history, she disappeared. To her family, she became a rumor. It would take more than a century, and a single curious name found in an old prison ledger for the truth to rise again. Margaret's story isn't one of crime, but of courage. Of a woman who defied a world that refused to forgive her, and who hid her love in the only way the world would allow. Her secret didn't vanish. It waited, buried in ink, in silence, in generations that never knew why their story began in the shadows. For more than a century, her name slept in the archives, unseen, untouched, almost erased. Until one small discovery brought her story back to life. Our search began not in an archive or a dusty library, but online, in a public family tree uploaded by a descendant of Margaret's parents. It seemed ordinary at first, until we noticed a single note beside the 1881 census entry. It read, "Margaret had a troubled life. I believe she had a daughter in 1886. Her parents raised the child as their own." That small comment changed everything. Could this hidden child be real? We dug deeper, through birth registers, parish records, and handwritten census lines. And there it was. July 19th, 1886. A baby girl named Jane Ann, born to a mother listed simply as Margaret P., domestic servant. No father's name. No mention of the past. The timelines fit perfectly. Margaret, recently released from prison, living quietly in Salford. A child born into secrecy. A family protecting its own. It was the missing piece that turned rumor into revelation. The daughter, Jane Ann, would grow up believing Margaret was her sister. Generations later, her descendants would inherit that story, unaware that their true ancestor had lived, suffered and fought for survival in a world that had condemned her, and now, through digital traces and crumbling pages, her voice finally returned. A name once reduced to a line in a prison record had become a full life again, one of hardship, love, and silence broken by time. But some stories don't end when the mystery is solved. They linger, changing the way we see the past and ourselves. Because once you've uncovered a forgotten life, you can't help but wonder how many more wait in the dark. Margaret Poole's story began as a fragment, a forgotten name on a yellowed prison record. But as the pieces came together, what emerged was more than a tale of crime and punishment. It was the portrait of a life shaped by poverty, shame, and endurance. In her world, survival was rebellion. Every small act, working in the mills, keeping her child safe, daring to hope for love again, was defiance against a system built to crush women like her. She was never meant to be remembered, yet here we are, speaking her name 130 years later. For centuries, the voices of women like Margaret were erased, their stories dismissed as disreputable, their pain hidden beneath moral judgment. But history is changing. Through archives, digital records, and the quiet persistence of curiosity, the forgotten are returning. When we say her name now, it carries the weight of everything she endured. The cold walls of Bellevue jail, the loss of her child, the small joys that history never thought to record. And maybe that's what remembering truly means. Not rewriting the past, but giving it back its humanity. Margaret Poole was not a statistic. She was a daughter, a mother, a survivor. And after more than a century in silence, her story has finally been heard.